This is a story you think you know. A bunch of colonists, ticked off about taxes, dump some tea in a harbor, fight a war, and bam! A new nation is born. It's the classic story of glorious triumph, heroic founding fathers, and the unstoppable march of liberty. But what if that story isn't the whole story? What if the American Revolution wasn't some clean, heroic epic, but a chaotic, desperate gamble that came terrifyingly close to failing at every single turn? What if beating the world's greatest superpower on the battlefield wasn't even the hardest part? What if the truly impossible task was what came after? This is the story of how a group of farmers, merchants, and smugglers, a truly ragtag bunch, took on an empire and, against all odds, won. But more than that, it's the story of what happened when the smoke cleared and those rebels had to turn to each other and ask the terrifying question, what now? Did this band of rebels really create a new America, or did they just unleash a storm they couldn't control? To get the revolution, you have to get that it wasn't just about money. Yeah, the taxes were infuriating. After the long and incredibly expensive 7 Years' War, a global fight where Britain went deep into debt to protect the colonies, London figured it was only fair for the Americans to help pay the bill, so they started rolling out taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, targeting everything from paper and paint to tea. To the colonists, this felt less like paying their share and more like being nickel-and-dimed by a landlord 3,000 miles away. It was like buying a video game and then the developer just keeps adding annoying microtransactions. But that famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," was about more than just their wallets. It was about a fundamental breakdown of trust. For over a century, Britain had practiced a policy of salutary neglect, which basically means they left the colonies alone to run their own affairs. Now, all of a sudden, Parliament was flexing its muscles, making rules and imposing its will without giving the colonists a single seat at the table. This wasn't some unified American people rising up in righteous fury. The 13 colonies were more like 13 rival siblings forced to share a room. They were deeply suspicious of each other, with different economies, clashing cultures, and their own identities. The population was a hodgepodge. You had farmers just trying to get by, merchants whose businesses were being strangled by British rules, and yes, a healthy number of smugglers who saw British regulations as a direct threat to their less-than-legal income. The rebels were hardly a monolith. Some were fired up by big Enlightenment ideas about liberty from philosophers like John Locke. Others were driven by the very real economic pain of British policies. And a lot of people were loyalists, who felt a deep connection to the crown and thought all this protest was treasonous madness. In fact, while it's hard to pin down, estimates suggest that somewhere around 15 to 20% of the colonists remained loyal to Britain, with some figures putting it as high as a third. This turned the coming conflict not just into a revolution, but a bitter civil war that pitted neighbors and even families against each other. This wasn't good versus evil. It was a messy, complicated, and deeply personal fight over rights, power, and identity. The British saw the colonists as ungrateful kids who needed to be put in their place. The colonists saw themselves as Englishmen being denied their basic rights. This massive misunderstanding would turn pubs and town squares into hubs of sedition and eventually turn colonial fields into bloody battlegrounds. The spark wasn't just a tax. It was the chilling realization that they were no longer equals in the British Empire. On paper, the American Revolution was a joke. It was like a high school football team challenging the reigning Super Bowl champs. In one corner, the British Army. This was, no exaggeration, the world's top fighting force. They were professional, disciplined, and hardened by wars fought all over the globe. The average British redcoat was a career soldier with the best gear, backed by the enormous wealth of the British Empire. On top of that, the British hired about 30,000 professional German mercenaries, known as Hessians, which only made the colonists angrier. And looming behind them all was the Royal Navy, the undisputed master of the seas, able to blockade ports and move troops with terrifying speed. And in the other corner, the Continental Army. Army might be a generous word, especially at the start. It was an undisciplined, unprepared, and often unpaid mob of citizen soldiers. Most were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers with little to no military training. Enlistments were short, and guys would often just pack up and go home to tend their farms. In the early days, they didn't even have a standard uniform. They were a patchwork of local militias that often refused to take orders from an officer from another colony. They were short on everything: guns, gunpowder, food, shoes, money. They were, in every sense of the word, a ragtag force. The first few years of the war proved the mismatch. General George Washington, the new commander-in-chief, lost one battle after another. He was pushed out of New York, chased across New Jersey, and his army always seemed one bad day away from completely falling apart. The British strategy was simple: crush the Continental Army in one big battle, grab the major cities, and this whole rebellion thing would just fizzle out. But it didn't. And that's because of a few key things the British war machine didn't count on. First, Washington's leadership. He wasn't the greatest battlefield tactician of his time, but his real genius was just holding the army together. His stubborn refusal to quit, even when everything looked hopeless, was the glue that kept the revolution from dissolving. The famous crossing of the Delaware on Christmas night in 1776 is the perfect example. It was a crazy, high-risk gamble to surprise Hessian troops at Trenton, and it worked. The victory was small, militarily speaking, but it was a massive shot in the arm for morale. It proved the rebels could win. Second, the Americans learned to adapt. They knew they couldn't win a traditional European-style fight, so instead, they used their home field advantage: guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run ambushes, and picking at Britain's long, vulnerable supply lines. The war wasn't just fought by the Continental Army either. It was also fought on the high seas, not by a real navy, which the Americans didn't have, but by something far more disruptive: privateers. Privateers were basically state-sanctioned pirates. The Continental Congress gave out letters of marque, which were official documents letting private ship owners attack and seize British merchant ships. It became a surprisingly effective industry of rebellion. Nearly 800 vessels became privateers. They couldn't take on a British warship, but they created chaos for British trade. They captured or destroyed around 600 British ships, costing the British economy an estimated $18 million, a mind-boggling amount of money back then. These privateers didn't just mess with supply lines, they also captured muskets and ammo that Washington's army desperately needed. But the single biggest factor, the one that truly turned the tide, was France jumping in. The French had been secretly sending the Americans guns and money for years, still salty about losing to Britain in the 7 Years' War. But after the stunning American victory at Saratoga in 1777, France was convinced the rebellion might actually work, so they officially entered the war as an American ally. This changed everything. Suddenly, Britain was fighting a world war. The French Navy challenged Britain's control of the seas, and French soldiers and cash poured into the American cause. The final decisive moment at Yorktown in 1781 would have been impossible without the French. American and French troops trapped the British Army under General Cornwallis on land, while the French fleet blockaded the coast, cutting off any hope of escape or rescue by sea. Trapped and outnumbered, Cornwallis had to surrender. Yorktown was the knockout punch. It didn't officially end the war, but it broke Britain's political will to keep fighting. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. The Ragtag Rebels, through sheer grit, smart tactics, and a crucial ally, had beaten the greatest superpower on Earth. But as the cheers faded, a much scarier reality set in. The war was over. The truly hard part was just getting started. Winning the war was a miracle. Creating a country from scratch? That was a whole different level of impossible. The years right after the revolution weren't a time of unity and celebration. It was a time of instability, uncertainty, and near-total chaos. Think about it. The colonists had just fought a war against a strong central power, the British king and parliament. Their biggest fear was tyranny. So, when they created their first national government in 1777, they swung to the complete opposite extreme. The result was the Articles of Confederation, and to put it bluntly, it was a disaster. The Articles created a government that was, on purpose, incredibly weak. It was more like a loose alliance of independent states than one unified country. The Central Congress had no power to tax. It could ask the states for money, but it couldn't make them pay. And as you can guess, most states, buried in their own war debts, usually paid little to nothing. Congress couldn't regulate trade between states, so they started treating each other like competitors, slapping tariffs on each other's goods and strangling the economy. There was no national court system, no single leader like a president, and to pass any important law, you needed 9 of the 13 states to agree, which almost never happened. The new nation was basically bankrupt and powerless. George Washington himself worried the country wouldn't last 20 years. The government was just a handful of unpaid clerks, a tiny army, and a mountain of debt. States were fighting over land, the currency was worthless, and foreign powers like Britain and Spain thumbed their noses at the new nation's borders, refusing to leave their forts on American soil. The whole project was falling apart. But while the national government was failing, something amazing and truly revolutionary was happening in the states. In a huge burst of political creativity, almost every state tossed out its old colonial charter and wrote a brand new constitution. This was the real laboratory of American democracy. It was here, from the ground up, that the rebels started building a new kind of America. These state constitutions were radical for their time. After fighting a king, the states designed governments with weak governors and super-strong legislatures, which they saw as the true voice of the people. Many of these constitutions included a Bill of Rights, a revolutionary idea meant to protect individual freedoms like speech, religion, and the press from the government. They started putting the ideals of the revolution into practice. More people got the right to vote. Some states, like Pennsylvania, drafted incredibly democratic constitutions that let all tax-paying free men vote, whether they owned property or not, a huge break from tradition. Pennsylvania's was so forward-thinking, it even demanded that all legislative meetings be public and that all new laws be published and debated before taking effect, ensuring transparency. These state-level experiments were the trial-and-error process that laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the federal Constitution. They were figuring out what government of the people by the people actually looked like. It's pretty incredible, right? The national government was a total mess, but in towns and state houses all over the country, a political revolution was quietly taking shape. This messy, chaotic process of building a nation is so much more interesting than the simple story we're usually told. If you find these deep dives into how things really happened as fascinating as I do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We get into these how did they actually pull it off moments in every video. All right, back to the chaos. The revolution wasn't just a political or military event. It was a social earthquake that shook every part of American life. Those big ideas of liberty and equality that were so great for rallying people to war, you couldn't just put them back in the box when the fighting stopped. People started questioning every old tradition and social ladder. One of the most immediate changes was in religion. Before the Revolution, the Anglican Church was the official state-sponsored church in many colonies, and its head was the King of England. After the war, its power crumbled. The fight for political freedom bled right into a fight for religious freedom, and states started cutting ties with official churches to protect freedom of belief. Social structures that had been around for centuries began to crack. Old English traditions like primogeniture, where the oldest son gets all the family land, were quickly thrown out. This was a direct attack on the kind of landed aristocracy that defined British society. Even the way people talked to each other started to change. The fancy, deferential title of gentleman began to fade. Replaced by the more equal citizen or just Mr. Society was becoming less about who your father was and more about what you could do. The revolution also unleashed powerful economic forces. Ending British rule meant ending mercantilism, a system rigged to benefit the mother country. Now, Americans were free to trade with anyone and start their own manufacturing industries. This kicked off a wave of entrepreneurial energy, though it also led to chaos as hundreds of new banks started printing their own money. But this revolutionary spirit had very real and very painful limits. The soaring words, "All men are created equal," were a glaring, hypocritical contradiction to the reality of slavery. And people noticed. The revolution sparked the first organized abolitionist movements, and many northern states passed laws for the gradual emancipation of enslaved people. Some enslaved men in the South were even granted freedom for fighting in the war. But in the Deep South, where the economy ran on slavery, the institution only became more dug in, especially after the invention of the cotton gin. The revolution created a generation of both free and enslaved black Americans who powerfully used the language of liberty to demand their own freedom. But the nation as a whole completely failed to live up to its own founding promise. Women, too, found themselves in a new, complicated spot. They had been crucial to the revolution, organizing boycotts, running farms and businesses, serving as nurses and spies. But that service didn't earn them political equality. Except for a short time in New Jersey, women couldn't vote and had limited access to education. Still, a new idea emerged: Republican motherhood. This was the notion that it was a woman's duty to raise virtuous, educated sons who would become good citizens. While this was a far cry from equality, it did open up new doors for female education, which future generations of women would use to fight for their own rights. And for Native Americans, the American victory was an absolute disaster. The British had, at least sometimes, tried to limit westward expansion. The new American governments, on the other hand, were openly hostile to native land claims and actively encouraged settlers to move west, leading to decades of brutal conflict and displacement. The liberty the colonists won came at a direct cost to the liberty and lands of the continent's original people. The social transformation was real, but it was also incomplete, messy, and full of contradictions. It challenged old ways of thinking and created new opportunities, but it also made things worse for many. America was changing, but the question of who would really get to be American was far from settled. By 1787, the United States was on the brink of collapse. The Articles of Confederation had proven ineffective, leaving the country broke and defenseless. Delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia, intending only to revise the Articles. However, figures like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton had a far more ambitious vision. They sought a complete overhaul of the government. What unfolded that summer was nothing short of a second revolution. The framers of the Constitution, now battle-worn and weary, set out to build a new government. They drew lessons from the chaos of the past decade, balancing the need for a strong government with the protection of individual liberties. The result was the United States Constitution, a document shaped by hard compromises, including the establishment of 3 government branches with a system of checks and balances. To further safeguard citizens' rights, a Bill of Rights was added. Though the Constitution laid the foundation for the nation, it wasn't without flaws. Compromises over slavery would later tear the country apart, and questions of who truly counted as "we the people" remained unresolved. Yet, the framers created a blueprint for a new America, one that balanced power and liberty, and whose legacy still shapes the modern world. In the end, the so-called Ragtag Rebels did more than win a war. They invented a new form of government, launching a political and social experiment. Their revolution wasn't just military, but intellectual. laying the groundwork for future struggles for equality and justice. While their work was imperfect, it set a precedent for future generations to continue building on.